Funding for this program is provided by this station and other public television stations and by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
If you don't know fear, it's just like having a sense of touch. So when you burn your finger, you know, it hurts. If you didn't have that, you'd burn your finger off. You know, you wouldn't, or you put your hand in a buzzsaw, you wouldn't know it was, you'd be looking off and you'd cut it off. If you don't know fear, in this kind of business, if you're playing on the cutting edge of social change in conflict situations where the, you know, where the sides are lined up and there's violence all the time, you know, you better learn to know it.
Tonight, part one of a visit with the radical hillbilly, Myles Horton. I'm Bill Moyers. Few people I know have seen as much change in the American South or helped to bring it about as Myles Horton. He's been beaten up, locked up, put upon and railed against by racists, toughs, demagogues, and governors. But for almost 50 years now, he has gone on with his special kind of teaching, helping people to discover within themselves the courage and ability to confront reality and change it. Myles Horton came to his mission from a childhood among the mountain people of Appalachia, a land rich in beauty but a colony of poverty. Nothing will change, said Horton to himself, until we change, until we throw off our dependence and act for ourselves. So in 1932, in the mountains west of Chattanooga, in one of America's poorest counties, Myles Horton founded the Highlander Folk School, dedicated to the belief that poor working-class people, adults, could learn to take charge of their lives and circumstance. At first, he ran workshops to train organizers for the CIO, Jim Crow laws for bad integration, but Horton invited blacks and whites alike, and Highlander became one of the few places in the South where the two races could meet under the same roof. In the early 1950s, Horton turned the emphasis of his workshops from union organizing to civil rights. Highlander was now a principal gathering place of the moving forces of the Black Revolution. Martin Luther King came. So did Rosa Parks, Andrew Young, Julian Bond, Stokely Carmichael, and scores of unsung foot soldiers in the long march of Southern blacks toward equality. The state tried to close it down. The Klan harassed it. State troopers raided it. But Highlander seemed indestructible, and so did Myles Horton. He's 75 now, and his school, from which he has stepped aside as leader in favor of younger colleagues, is preparing to celebrate its 50th anniversary next year. I thought it a good time to pay a visit to Myles Horton at Highlander, now located on a farm near Knoxville. Myles, you've upset a lot of people down here over the years. The mill owners said that Highland was about the boldest and most insulting thing to the Anglo-Saxon South that has yet been done. One Georgia governor said you were a cancerous group spreading throughout the South. The state of Tennessee closed you down, confiscated your property, and sold it at auction. The Ku Klux Klan beat up your staff and burned your buildings. A United States Senator had you ejected from his hearings. I mean, what's a nice man like you doing upsetting all those people?
Well, I don't try to upset people. I try to help people grow and be creative and fulfill themselves as people. And in the process of doing that, they upset a lot of people. And
how do you mean?
Well, they start doing things, asserting their rights, for example, working people asserting their rights to have a union, asserting their rights to be treated decently. People in the mountains assert their rights to be left alone to live their own way if they want to, without having the absentee landowners run them out of their holdings, their heritage. And we try to help people, you know, stand up against this kind of thing. We try to help people become empowered so they themselves can do things, and that's very, very irritating. One of the reasons they confiscated Highlander was because the charge was made by the governor of Georgia that this cancerous growth was spreading over the South, and that the civil rights movement came out of Highlander. And only a racist white person could make that assumption that some white people had to be doing that kind of thing. So they assumed that since a lot of the black people had been at Highlander long before the Civil Rights Movement and during the Civil Rights Movement, blacks couldn't do anything themselves, so it had to be some white people. So they got 4 or 5 other governors together and they closed Highlander. And it was only after they closed it they found out that they, didn't have anything to do with the Civil Rights Movement. The black people running the Civil Rights Movement.
I think that's what really upset a lot of people.
And they got terribly upset,
yeah.
I think, when they found out they couldn't stop it by confiscating Highlander. When they first came, they came and padlocked the building. And some of the news reporters said, "What are you laughing about?" I was standing outside laughing. They took a picture of me standing there laughing. The sheriff padlocking the building. I said, "My friend here, he thinks he's padlocking Highlander." But I said, Highlander's an idea. You can't padlock an idea.
You say Highlander's an idea. What's the idea?
Well, we have a philosophy that we know that we can identify. We believe in people. Our loyalty is to people, not institutions or structures, and we try to translate that belief and trust in people's ability to learn into facilitating people's learning. Now, you don't teach people things, particularly adults. You help them learn, and insofar as you learn how people learn, you can help, and that's a powerful dynamic force when you realize that people themselves in these hollers and in these factories and these mines, can take much more control of their lives than they themselves realize.
How does it work? I mean, how do you help people to learn something like that?
Well, first thing you have to clarify is that you have to understand, you have to know that people, working people, common people, the uncommon common people, they're the most uncommon people in the world, the common people, have mainly a past. They're adults, unlike children in the regular school system, who have practically no past and are told by the schools that their present isn't worth anything, or are taught, they're taught about the future. They're prepared for the future. Adults come out of the past with their experiences. So you run a program at Highlander based on their experiences, their experiential learning, from which they may not have learned very much because they haven't learned how to analyze it, but it's there. The grist for the mill is there. And our job is to help them understand if they can analyze their experiences and build on those experiences, and maybe transform those experiences even, then they have a power they're comfortable with. So people, first I should tell you that not only are people adults with a past, with experiences, but they are leaders in their communities. I don't mean official leaders, but grassroots leaders.
You mean not bankers and...
No, they're the people in the people's organizations, like labor unions or community organizations of various kinds. Well, those people come, and we say, okay, what are your experiences that relate to this topic? Not all your experiences, but the experiences that relate to this topic. Now, they haven't considered those experiences too important. They haven't thought of it as being very important. We say this is very important because that's the curriculum, that's the building stones that we're going to use here, and it's something you can take back with you because it'll be, you brought it here. So we start out.
They didn't know it when they got here.
They haven't learned to analyze those experiences so they can learn from them. People say you learn from the experiences. You only learn from experiences that you learn from. It's not all experiences, and we try to help them learn from their experiences in such a way that they go back, they continue to learn. But we have to also learn from our experiences. And one of the things we have to do, in addition to what they have to do, is to learn how to relate our experiences to theirs. And you do that by analogy, or you do by storytelling. You don't get off and say, look, here's some facts we want to dump on you. We say, oh, you might consider this. Now, this happened to somebody kind of like you in a different situation. So we get them doing the same thing with each other. Get peer teaching going, where everybody is in the circle is part of a peer teaching group.
What's radical about that? What was radical about it back in 1930?
It's terribly radical because educationally it goes against what education is supposed to. Education is supposed to prepare people to live in whatever system the educational school system is about. Like in our system, it's to prepare people to live under capitalism and be, fit into that system. In the Soviet Union, it's to prepare people to live in that system and fit in that system. That's what education, official education is all about, to prepare people to fit into the system and support the system.
And Highlander?
And turn them, really it is to turn them into nuts and bolts to keep the system together, you see, whatever kind of system it is. Highlander says, no, you can't use people that way. People are, you know, creative. You got to allow them to do a lot of things that don't fit any kind of systems, and you got to have a lot of deviation. We believe in a lot of pluralism. We believe in people keeping a lot of their old customs and adding new ones. And we said that's what enriches life. So we're going to focus on that. Well, there's a lot of dynamics in it, a lot of power in that scares people. When people in the South before the Civil Rights Movement started beginning to feel that they could do something in spite of the laws and in spite of tradition, and started doing it, then, you know, all hell broke loose. We had experienced earlier in the 30s, we started back in the Depression and in the pre-industrial union movement in this country before the CIO started. And many of our students who had been in Highlander before, you know, became leaders in the unions in the early days when it's rough. And when we first started organizing, it was illegal to have a picket line, and a lot of our activities were illegal. Highlander itself was illegal up until about 4 years ago. We defied the state law on segregation in private schools, which stayed on the books long after the public schools were integrated. You know, we had to work that way to live up to our principles. So I get off the subject a little bit, but you know, the people have all this power, but it's suppressed by the public school system and by the institutions. We having loyal to the people, not the institutions, you know, always try to throw our weight on the side of the people and help them do things that are right. Now, you can't get people to do something they think is wrong.
Yeah.
You know, you can't, you know, people say, well, Highlander's a propaganda institute. You get all these ideas in people's heads and they go out and do things they learn at Highlander. You know, that's not the way things are.
They were in their mind.
They're in their minds. They're seeds. What you do, you develop those seeds. They're crusted over, you know, with all kind of things, and the people don't even know they're there. We know they're there. We dig for them, and we cultivate those seeds. We help, you know, prepare the ground for them to grow, and we help people learn they can learn from each other, that they're stronger. Individualism is enhanced by being part of a group. You know, individuality, I guess, would be a better way of saying, is enhanced by being part of a group, instead of telling people, you know, they should go it alone, they should be competitive, they should, you know, compete with their fellow men. And we say, work together, and you'll be a better person.
What started you thinking radical thoughts a long time ago?
Well, Bill, I was asked that question by a priest back in the CIO days when there were a lot of efforts to have labor schools, and Highlander we were officially designated as the CIO school of the South, and we had more programs than anybody else. So they had communist sponsored labor schools, Catholic sponsored labor schools, and some independent schools like Highlander. And a priest in Nashville who was trying to start a Catholic school kept coming to Highlander, and he says, I go back and I do everything I learned at Highlander. I go back and I just imitate everything I learned. It doesn't work. Doesn't work. And he said, it's no good just to look at it, and because it's something I don't understand. Maybe I can get at it by asking you what books influenced your life the most. Because I got to understand this, he said. And I said, well, I can tell you, but it won't help you any. Because, you know, like all people, I got my own track of development, and my own background is a part of it. I said, I grew up in a religious family, like most people in the South. And I said, undoubtedly, the first book that influenced my life was the Bible. There's no question about that. All my early influences grew out of the Bible and things like that. You know, not an ultra-religious family, but a conventionally religious family, and that was the values in little country towns, you know. People, you went to church and you went to school. There wasn't anything else to do. And so I said, you know, I no question. And the values of the Bible I still hold dear. I said, he said, well, what particular? And I said, okay. I said, there's two, you know, the New Testament, the Old Testament. The New Testament, you learn about love. And I said, you can't be a revolutionary, you can't want to change society if you don't love people. There's no point in it. So, you know, you love people. That's right out of the Bible. And the other thing is Old Testament tells primarily about the creation. God was a creator. If you're going to be people born in God's image, you got to be creators. You can't be followers or puppets. You got to be creators. So from the Bible, I guess people ought to be creative. You ought to love people. People ought to be creative. Well, he thought that was rather skimpy theological background. But anyway, I was trying to tell him things that affected me. And then I said, I got so discouraged by seeing the people in the church and the politicians and all being hypocritical, that I almost got very cynical about society. And the way I knew that's because I used to work in a store, and I used to do things where I knew people when I was growing up. And I just found that the leaders, were were all hypocrites. So I said, well, that's the way people are. So I was getting very cynical. And I was deciding, well, what's it all about? It's a business of loving people and sharing with people, and it's a cynical world. So at that time, I always loved poetry. I always read a lot of poetry. And I ran into Shelley.
Shelley?
Shelley. And he said the same thing. He said, just like you did.
It's been a long time since
what
I read
Shelley got to do? Well, Shelley was a young rebel. He died
sure.
about the same age Christ died. But he wrote some wonderful poems about, defying all authority if it's wrong, to obey authority, and living your own life. And you do things without fear of punishment or for rewards, and somehow
you do them
you do it because they're right.
Yeah.
You do it because they're right. And Shelley just hit me at the right time, and he gave me a feeling that I wasn't going to get cynical. I was going to live my own life, but it made me think independently and say, well, I'm going to create my own life. I'm not going to play the games of other people if I don't believe in them. I'm going to find a way to survive and live my own life. Shelley did that for me. Then I realized that what's good for me is not, if I just want to live my own life, I've got to think everybody should have the same rights I have, a universality of rights. If they're right for me, then I've got to work for them to be right for everybody else, or not. I have no right to them.
You do believe there are certain truths and rights self-evident.
Yeah, and those have to be shared. It can't be for me. I can't have something that isn't for you or even from the poorest person, in the world. I believe that. I believe you got to work for that. Well, I had nothing in my background that prepared me to work for things like that. I didn't have any understanding. I'd gone to a little liberal Presbyterian college and had all the kind of academic background that anybody would have. And so there's nothing, my schooling has helped me on that, nothing in my background, nothing in the Bible, nothing in Shelley. And it was then that I discovered about Marxism and analysis of society on a class basis. And I discovered that first, not by knowing about Marx, but by the Federalist Papers, when Hamilton talked about classes. That's when I first got the understanding of classes from Alexander Hamilton. He says if the workers would vote their interests, the farmers their interests, the merchants their interests. That was the first insight I had. Then I found Marx said the same thing a little more elaborately. So I found out that from Marx I could get tools, not blueprints, tools that I could use for analyzing society. That helped me analyze. Then I had to get a synthesis of my religious background and my understanding of economic forces. And then I started trying to work on a synthesis. And that's how I those are the things that helped kind of get me to thinking and gave me some kind of guidance. Now, I've never been a doctrinaire, religious person, a doctrinaire Shelley advocate, or a doctrinaire Marxist, but I got from all those things the ideas that helped me.
I thought maybe you might have become a Christian poet activist.
Well, there's a lot of poetry in life. I think somebody said, Highlander's a myth, and I said, well, it's a poem too. It's a picture. It's because it's not of anything that some of us here have done, but the people who've come here have made a mosaic out of Highlander, and poetry is a beautiful thing,
The segregationists and the clanners and the politicians were fond in the old days of calling Highlander communistic and of calling you a communist. Were you ever a communist?
I was never a member of the Communist Party, and I was invited to be a member of the Communist Party, and then I was told 2 years later that I couldn't be a member of the Communist Party by the head of the Communist Party. And I said,
why?
Well, I asked him the same question, and he said, well, when we first wanted you to be member of the Communist Party. You know, you were a radical activist. I was active in college, and we thought, you know, you'd be a good communist. But he says, now, if you started Highlander and began to get ideas of your own, you know, you wouldn't be trustworthy. And, you know, because you'd want to do things that you wouldn't follow discipline.
You couldn't accept any system without challenging it.
Now,
Any doctrinaire.
No, I said, you know, when they first talked to me, I said, well, I like a lot of things that communists believe in, just like I like a lot of things that a lot of groups believe in, you know. I like what Christianity is supposed to be, you know. Those things are not practiced, but I like the ideals. But I said, you know, I come from down the southern mountains, and you know, I guess maybe it's part of my background, I couldn't take any kind of authoritarian, and nobody could, I couldn't say to any group, any organization, I will do what you want me to do. I'll have to do what I want to do. My conscience has to be my guide. That's what I told Senator Easton.
Senator Easton, yes.
Senator Easton, I was investigated by the Senate Internal Security, I guess Internal Security, but by Eastland. And Eastland, Eastland says that if you're not going to answer these questions, he says, you know, you can just take the Fourth Amendment, you know, and protect yourself.
Fifth Amendment.
Fifth Amendment. See, I would advise you. I said, look, I got good legal advice. I've been advised by all the lawyers that I could do that. But I said, that's not my way of working. I always talk about what I want to talk about, and I don't want to what I don't want to talk about, I don't want to talk about. I'm going to do that right here. And he said, well, you can't do that. And I said, well, yeah, I said, I believe I can, because in the beginning of this country, there's a revolution, and people had all the rights. And they delegated rights to the state, they delegated rights to the federal government, but they reserved unto themselves one right. That's freedom of speech. So that's still reserved. I'm part of the people. That's reserved. I use it the way I please. And nobody can tell me how to use my right to speak or not to speak. He wanted me to talk about other people.
He wanted you to name other people who...
He said, yeah, he said he wanted to ask if certain people had been at Highlander and certain people I knew certain people. And I said, I speak for myself. I choose to say what I believe. You ask me any question about me you want, I'll answer it. But I will not answer a question of anybody else. They have to answer for themselves, just like I answer for myself. So I will answer no question about anybody. The first person he asked about was my wife. I said, I speak for nobody but myself. And then he gave me this song and dance I just told you, and I said, no. Ask me about me. I love to talk about what I believe in. That's what I've been doing all my adult life. And he said, throw him out, throw him out. And he had the guards take me and throw me out. It's the only time I ever made the front page of the New York Times.
Look, Myles, if everyone made a private heresy out of challenging the system, how would society function?
I believe in laws, but I know that the only way laws can have any meaning, they have to be just laws. So for just laws to have a meaning and to have a society of laws, you've got to challenge unjust laws. This concept is provided for by the amendment to the Constitution, you know, or trials where you could appeal. This is not as kind of outside the reality as it seems to people.
You think that's what Jefferson might have meant when he said that every generation ought to entertain the possibility of its own revolution?
That's right, yeah. I've quoted that many times. I said, you know, I started out, I thought there ought to be a revolution in this country. I mean a revolution that you know, is run democratically, because I believe in democracy. We don't have it, and none of the countries I know of, and I know
we don't
all
have
of them.
it. We hear all these salutes
democracy.
to democracy on inaugural day.
No, we have some trimmings of democracy. We have some like the parliament electoral system, which might have worked in the early days when you had a handful of people, but you know, people don't have anything to say about the people they elect today. You know that. That's why only a small percentage of people vote. They know that their thing is set up so too far away from them. We have to really examine all of our structures in this country to make them more democratic. You can't have democracy at the workplace when a system is run for the benefit of the profit of somebody instead of for the benefit of all the people. You know, so we can't have economic democracy under a profit-taking system. We can't have political democracy when we don't have some kind of decentralization that brings government closer to the people. That sounds like Reagan, you know. But you do have to break the system down to where people can have more say about their own lives. Might be less efficient, but be more creative and more. I believe in a kind of a pluralistic sort of society. We've never, no country, no system has, to my mind, you know, thought too seriously about how you do this. And I think it's one of the things we ought to be about in this country.
On your journey to Highlander, you were studying in New York at Union Theological Seminary under Rhino Niebuhr.
I went up there. I'll tell you what happened. I used to stay with a preacher over at Crossville, Tennessee, a fellow named Nightingale. He's as near a saint as I ever ran into. He instead of just preaching on Sunday, he'd go out and help people. He'd go to the hospital and empty bedpans. You know, he was a worker. He identified with people. And I liked him, and I used to stay with him when I was bumming around the mountains. I was state student YMCA secretary for a while, and then I worked for the Presbyterian Church in the mountains. I used to know him quite well. So a year after I finished college, I was kind of flipping around trying to figure out what I was going to do. And by that time, I had discovered that my dream to get a job teaching in a college or a high school in the mountains would be realized, because I found that those schools were not what I thought they were, what I imagined them to be. I found they were all indoctrinating people, all building people into the status quo. They were all, you know, doing kind of molding people instead of liberating people. Nothing creative about them. So I decided I couldn't do that. So I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I wanted to work educationally in terms of my values, but I didn't know how. And this preacher says, you ought to go to, he said, you don't know enough, that you're too ignorant. And he said, you ought to go to Union Theological Seminary, a place like that, someplace where you'd like the intellectual atmosphere and so on. And I said, never heard of it. But he wrote and got an application. And one day he said, well, you know, you don't have to go, you can fill it out. So they won't, he said, they won't accept you. He said, they're pretty, it's hard to get into. It's a kind of an intellectual place, and you don't have enough good education to do it. But it wouldn't hurt, just fill it out, and even if they accept you, you don't have to go. And to get him off of my neck, I signed that application and sent it in. Well, the reason I was accepted, not because I was academically, trained for it. They picked the best of the country. But because they wanted somebody from the South and from the mountains, and somebody had played football, and somebody was a hillbilly. You know, that's how I got into Union.
A token hillbilly.
I know that. I know I was a token. Otherwise, I could have never gotten in, because everybody there were, they were all smart, academically smart people. But Niebuhr was there for the first year, and he was a flaming socialist, a pacifist, and with a lot of qualifications and exploring. But most of all, he'd run a workers' church in Detroit. He had
just come from that church.
Just come from there, and he was
what he had seen with the workers and the Ford and the industry.
Yeah. He was exploring these other things. So he was just made for me, and he took me under his wing, not as a token person, but somebody.
You became friends, didn't you?
And we became very good friends. I spent a lot of time with him, and he moved me way ahead of myself. He put me in a seminar with graduate students and professors and priests and people like that, and I couldn't understand a word he was saying.
Did you think about dropping out?
Hell, I told him I had a break, and I went through one whole 2-hour session as a seminar, 2 short periods, and I kept thinking, well, it's over my head. I don't have these conceptual, I don't understand these things, but I'm trying to learn, and it was nice. Then I went to the first or the other, but after the first one, I said, I can't cut it. I knew it wasn't for me. So I walked out. I said, I'm not going back in, Ryan. I said, I appreciate you inviting me in, but I can't. I don't understand what's going on. I can go over to the library, and if I can't read one book, I can read another. I said, I know how to read. I know how to learn, but I can't understand what you're talking about. I don't have enough background. And we were out in the quadrangle. He's a smoker, and we go outside to smoke, and we're standing there, and he said, "Now don't do that, Myles." He said, "Don't." He said, he turned around to these people and he says, "Now this fellow, he can't understand what I'm saying. He should be able to understand. I want to talk to people like him because he's got a good mind," he says. And but he says, "What about the rest?" And they admitted to the man that they didn't understand it. They didn't have a nerve to tell him. They all said, "No, we
don't understand.
We don't understand it." Every one of them said it. There's a judge there. And he said, yep. Said, he's right. Says, we were too embarrassed to do it. Ryan says, Myles, you got to stay in here because you don't want to tell me the truth. And he said, anytime in the middle of something, you just hold up your hand and tell me what's wrong, and I'll listen. But that's the kind of relationship I have with Ronnie.
There was a story about you attending a parade there.
Yeah, oh yeah. What happened was that I played football in college, and I had a big maroon sweater. I'd taken the letter C off. I was Cumberland University, and I just wore it to keep warm. And I didn't have any money, so I hitchhiked to New York to go to school, and I wait on tables. No, I didn't have. I just a poor guy trying to go to school. I started out doing it when I was 15, so I was pretty good at it by then. And I was there's a May Day parade. May Day was big then, and I'd never seen a May Day parade. May Day was when you, in my background, when you went around and decorated the graves and the cemeteries, you know. So a big May Day parade up there, and I thought, well, I'll go to the parade, you know. So I went down, and there's people that, you know, a tremendous lot of people there, and they had all these banners and people marching and unions and radical organizations and some religious organizations, and I was standing there just, you know, watching.
Just a bystander?
Oh yeah, I was on the sidewalk. I didn't even know what I was going, what the parade was all about. And so they had the what they call the Cossacks then, and it was a good name for them. The police rode horses, and they rode along, and they rode between the bystanders on the sidewalk and the paraders to keep, you know, keep them separated. And this cop on a horse leaned over and says, "There's a red son of a bitch," and he just wham right on top of my head. He said, "You got a red sweater on." But the amusing part about that was that I used to try to explain my confusion about the initials they used for the Communist Party in the early days, the CP. And I grew up in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in the mountain. That was CP. And all my life, CP meant Cumberland Presbyterian. That sweater came from a Cumberland Presbyterian college that marked me as a red, you see.
Was it a radicalizing moment?
Oh, man, it moved me. You know, like Castro says, the Bay of Pigs made a communist country out of Cuba. This moved me to thinking very fast, you know, about what it's all about. What's the police power? That's my first run-in with police. You know, I lived in small towns. I'd never lived in a city, in the country. I'd had trouble, but you know, but I never had been beaten up or never had. So I saw the police as part of the establishment, part of the oppressive something.
And that explosive power.
At that time, I was beginning to try to understand Karl Marx, just theoretically. Most of my background was a religious background, mountain background, kind of a working, but I had no radical influence.
What did you see in the South in those days that made you believe there was a need for a school like Highlander?
Well, the need for it was the poverty that I grew up knowing about and being a part of. See, I started making my own living when I was 15, so I could go to school. So I knew, you know, I didn't read about it. I knew it, lived it. And I knew all my people and all my, you know, the people I grew up with and my relatives and all. And I knew the poverty. And I knew that people were shut in, you know, the life was too narrow. And there ought to be some way, you know, to get something more creative going. And I also knew that industry was going to come in. You know, you could make an analysis of that kind very simply. And that the industry would come in to exploit the people, and I didn't want to be exploited. I wanted them to learn how to organize so they could, you know, take care of the inners. So one of the chief purposes we had in mind was to we'd try to change society by understanding it. So we'd have a decent society, but one of the immediate things was to help people understand, you know, union, labor, and political strategy for working people.
You really wanted to try to organize workers.
We weren't going to organize. Highlander is not an organization school. Fact is, we've had hundreds and hundreds of people at Highlander who've been organizers, but we say if you do a good educational job, teach people how to think, how to analyze, they can become organizers. You don't train them to be organizers. Well, I don't agree with this training people to do things. You liberate them and they train themselves.
So what was the germ of your idea?
We did want to help develop leadership for unions and leadership for tremendous lot of leadership in the South came out of Highlander, through Highlander.
Why unions? Why did that appeal to you?
Well, it's the base of economic democracy. I don't believe you can have democracy with just political democracy. I used to talk to Martin Luther King a lot about that, and he agreed theoretically, but it was only later on that he started putting into practice the idea that you had to, wasn't enough, as he says, to be able to eat a hamburger with a white person, you had to have the money to buy it. And he got killed when he did that, you see, trying to organize the garbage workers. Well, so I knew from the beginning economic democracy had to go hand in hand with political democracy, so I was always keyed into that.
Can you describe for me what conditions were like for the workers in this part of the country in those days?
Well, they tried to organize Elizabethton up here, where my ancestors came from, Watauga Settlement. And that was in the late 20s. And they brought troops in to break the strike and run the people back in the hills until they behaved themselves. And all they were doing was trying to have cut down on the 12-hour workday and get more than $8 a week for working. And, you know, they beat them into submission. They? I mean, the company. It was the first multinational. It came here in the 20s.
What was it?
It was a Bimberg rayon plant. It was a multinational plant. Of course, we didn't know that then. But that's what it was that I'm talking about.
And when the workers tried to organize?
They tried to organize. And that plant was built on the land. One of my ancestors got the first land grant in Tennessee, and that's where that plant was built, right on that spot. But those people were just being pushed around. Now, these people had a background, like my background. You know, they were people that, you know, came out of a good tradition and so on.
The mountain people are supposed to be pretty tough, pretty independent.
Well,
but
they're
able to take care of themselves.
Tough, but tough till you know you bring the troops in. They're tough when you know you can't stand up against hired gun thugs and police and troops.
Well, given that reality, why did you think that a bunch of teachers at a seclusive place like this could identify with men in circumstances as painful as those?
Okay, now, I believe that it had to be done. And I was determined to try to do it. And I was determined to identify, have these people to perceive that I had solidarity with them. I knew that had to be.
Yeah, but here you were, Union,
so I had,
Theological Seminary, Chicago University.
But a year ago up in West Virginia, they got to arguing about people who'd come down, these experts who'd come in from these universities, and somebody says, well, you know, your friend Myles Horton is one of them. The hell he is. He said, he's never been to school. We know him. You know.
But why did you think you could establish that?
I knew it was a handicap, but I thought I could overcome it somehow. Well, I tell you, it's very interesting. We did make a terrible lot of mistakes the first year because of that. You know, what we had learned that we thought you could apply pretty much like you taught it'll apply. So we fell flat on our face. We weren't getting through to the people. So we had a little self-criticism, and we said, what we know, the solutions we have are for problems that people don't have. And we're trying to solve their problems by saying that they have the problems that we have the solutions for. That's academia. So it won't work. So what we got to do is to unlearn much of what we've learned and then try to learn how to learn from the people. In other words, instead of learning from what we learned academically, we've got to learn how to relate to their experiences.
Well, how did you do that?
Well, we did that by a very strict censorship on ourselves to try to quit talking the jargon and quit trying to use educational terminology and go out and listen to the people. Now, you listen to the people, not just words, but by their emotions, by what you see around, by the children, by the surroundings. There's a lot of way of communications. We had to learn a whole new way of communicating.
I mean, did you have to ask them what they wanted to learn?
No, you don't ask them. You just go around and get to know them well enough that you can figure it out. So you go around, and one of the first things I figured out was all of my interest in democracy and brotherhood, all of which I think is sound, was that they didn't want to talk about democracy and brotherhood. They wanted something in their bellies. They wanted some clothes on their back, and they weren't listening to anything we said about that. So we had to learn, and we had to help them with their problems. We had to start cooperatives. We had to get organized in unions. We had to fight for them to get, surplus food. We had to identify with them in their economic struggles.
The realities.
The realities that they perceived as the important thing before we could share the things that we perceived. That was the kind of learning we had to go through.
But tell me specifically, Myles, what did you do to these workers when they came here in the early days?
Okay. In the first place, you have to have their confidence, because by helping them with their problems, like I said earlier, we had to learn from the people and start where they were and deal with their problems. And we say, look, who's been telling you what to do? Teachers, preachers, politicians. And did it work? Was it good advice? Did it work for you? Well, I don't know. Well, you wouldn't be here if that worked, because you've had plenty of advice. You had plenty of people telling you what to do. So we're not going to do that. We're not going to compound that. We're going to try something else. We've got to try to build on what you know and your experiences and help you understand that your neighbors have some experiences and other people in another place, maybe in another country, have some experiences that relate to this problem, all that are related, tied in with your experience. I remember one fellow who came from over here in the mountains up near the North Carolina line. He said, when I came here, he says, I had one little piece of a pie that had all the answers. The pie has all the answers. He said, I had a little slice of that pie. And Joe here, he had a little slice. Somebody else had a little slice. And Myles told us about some other people that had a little slice, and he contributed that slice. So now we got the whole pie. Now I know everything. I got the whole pie. I'm going to take the whole pie back home with me instead of my little slice. But he was proud of the fact that he'd contributed a slice, you know. He hadn't just learned from other people. Well, that's what happens.
You didn't.
And but in addition to get that information, you got to get motivation. And motivation comes from within, not from outside in something. You don't motivate somebody. You help them learn to motivate themselves. So what you do is to try to get people to have more confidence in themselves and their peers, and to understand it's up to them. There's nobody else can do it.
Many of these people would go back and put their heads in front of a billy club, wouldn't they?
Yes, and then they'd get in jail and so on, and they'd yell for help, and we'd go help them, but we'd never show our face. You know, we'd work behind the scenes with them.
And yet you were arrested several times.
Oh, well, you know, if you are perceived by the enemy of working people or enemy of blacks to have solidarity with them, if that's their perception of you, then they're going to treat you like they treat them. In other words, you're one of them, so they'll beat you up or jail you just like them. That's not the price you pay. That's a privilege you have.
Well, when was the first time you were arrested?
Oh, the first time I was arrested was in second year of Highlander in 33. There's a strike at Wilder, Tennessee.
Now, that was in one of the poorest.
That's where we were living in. Highlander was located in one of the 11 poorest counties in the United States. There's a higher percentage of people on welfare in that county. It's only 11. I don't know how it rated among the 11, but it was one of the 11. Wilder was another one of the counties. Another one of the counties in the mountains of Tennessee. So they had a strike. And they had a strike for some time, and some of the people came over and asked if we could help them somehow with that strike. And I said, I don't know enough about it. They said, well, I said, I'll go over, go over and visit. I went over there, and I was trying to get some of them to come to Highlander, because that's the way we work. Don't go in and do it. You pull them out, and then send them back in to do it. Or they go back where they came from to do it. It's their base. And word got around that I was outsiders around stirring up trouble, and the National Guard, there's a lot of young National Guard people over there. The governor had sent the National Guard to protect the property. There'd been some violence. And they arrested me. And I said, you can't arrest me, we got to give a charge, And they had these bayonets punched in my belly and my backbone, so I wasn't arguing with them much. I was kind of gently suggesting, they ought to have a charge, So they had a little huddle over the side. One guy said, you're arrested for coming over here and getting information and going back and teaching it.
And that was a crime.
And that was what I was arrested. So I always said this, the only time I was ever arrested with a charge was accurate. That's exactly what I was doing.
What was it like for those men in Wilder when they went on strike? It was a company town, wasn't it?
It was a company town, and the company was determined to break the union. And during the Depression, and a lot of people wanting jobs, so it was fairly easy, but the people wouldn't, they just wouldn't give up. So they brought the troops in to protect the property. There's no welfare programs there, and the Red Cross is in existence, but the head of the Red Cross was the wife of the superintendent of the mines, and she gave Red Cross flour to the scabs, not to the union people, not to the strikers. No striker could get any Red Cross free, but people who were working to supplement the company pay, they got all the Red Cross. I exposed that, and as an investigation, it was it supported my charge. They went over and they found that was absolutely true. Nobody believed it. And when I came out with an expose of what had happened, the Red Cross was a sacred cow, And I said, you know, that's what the Red Cross is doing there, and that's what everybody's doing. These people are starving to death, literally starving. If people, you know, babies getting extended bellies, and people are hungry. And, you know, they're eating up everything in the countryside, and we've got to do something about this situation. Then the editorial started coming, saying I was a communist stirring up trouble, you know. That was stirring up trouble, because I was the one that was, if I hadn't gone there, it wouldn't have been this trouble, you know. So that was the kind of thing you were into.
Tell me about that strike in, I think it was 1937, in North Lumberton, North Carolina, when you called for the pretty girls and the American flag and someone to play the banjo.
Oh, well, you see, most people, when they're doing educational work at organizations, so heavy-handed, no sense of humor, you know. And working people, you know, they have bread and roses, too, in their mind, and they got... people think the self-interest of people is just economic self-interest, but they have a lot of other self-interest. You know, part of it is getting a little pleasure out of the most miserable situation. They have a wonderful sense of humor. They have to survive. So if you don't have that, you know, you don't relate to the people. Now you got to go fishing with them and drink beer with them and have fun with them and so on. So one of the things I would do over there, we had a mass picket line, and around the mill, and the sheriff and the deputies couldn't keep, we had so many people, we'd have 1,000 people, they couldn't deal with us very well. So they'd call for the state highway patrol to come in and help. And the governor wouldn't station the highway patrol there for political reasons or for other reasons, but when they called for it, they'd come in. Well, I'd helped organize a newspaper guild in Raleigh while I was over there working, and so I had my Confederates there, and the newspaper was right across the street from the highway patrol. So when they'd start out to come to Lumberton, to come to down there, then they'd call me. One of the newspaper guys would call me. They had to, anybody that saw them leave was supposed to call, send word for me. You see, they were coming. But it took about an hour to get there.
For the patrol?
Patrol to get there. And they'd call them, and we'd have a picket line. Wouldn't let anybody get anywhere near that mill, a real militant picket line, and tough, you know. And the time the troops got there, we'd send practically everybody home. We'd keep all the gals around. We got some pretty women, and we get some guys who played instruments, guitar playing. And by the time they got there, there'd be just a few women sitting around, and fellas sitting there picking the guitar, and me sitting under a tree listening to the music, you know, and nothing going on. And then when they'd drive up with they drove up with their masks on, you know, getting ready for warfare, and their guns in the cars. And these girls would go over and say, "Hey, buddy, you know, hey, how you doing? You're a nice looking guy. What do you got there?" You know, and they'd start hiding their stuff. They're so embarrassed. We'd pull stuff like that. And then the troops would go back and they'd say, "Oh, you know, we couldn't, nothing's happening down there."
Just a bunch of pretty girls.
And then nothing happens. And then the company would call them, and by the time they got back, we'd have 1,000 people back on the picket line. Well, we had to pull things like that all the time.
Was this the place, Lumberton, North Carolina, when the 4 guys came after you with the guns and you made your best organizing speech?
Yeah, I had some experiences there. That was very educational for me.
What happened that time?
I was trying to get those people to make decisions, because the big thing is to get people to have confidence they can make decisions. I was doing pretty well, so they made all the plans, the committees were set, they made all the decisions. I just sit with them and encourage them to make decisions. But it got pretty rough. And it looked like we were about to lose the strike. And the strike committee got pretty desperate. They weren't so sure of themselves. So they came up to my room one time and said, "We got to talk about plans." And then they talked it over, and they said, "Myles, you got to tell us what to do." I said, "We just go as far as we can." And I said, "You got to run this union, so you might as well learn. You learn when it's easy, you learn when it's rough. And if you don't learn to make tough decisions, you know, I learned. I get the learning experience you don't. I need it less than you do. You need the learning experience. I could get along without it, you know. So you got to make the decision." They said, "But there's 2,000 people involved in this decision." And I said, "Sure, that's why you know, it's kind of important decision, but you got to make it." And one guy said, "You know, you got to make this decision." I said, No. He said, "Now you're not at Highlander running a school. You were running a strike, and you know these people, you know, it's a serious business, and you can't just say we got to learn to do this." So I said, "No. Got to make it." So he just reached in his pocket and pulled out a gun, and he said, "You son of a bitch, make this decision right now." I came near going back on my principles of education than I ever did in my life.
But did you stick firm?
Yeah, I did. I said, you know, you can win this round, but you still won't know how to make decisions after you get through. I'll admit I was scared. I've usually been scared in situations like that.
You do know fear.
Oh, yes, I know fear. You didn't survive. I wouldn't have been here today if I didn't know fear. If you don't know fear, it's just like having a sense of touch. So when you burn your finger, you know, it hurts. If you didn't have that, you'd burn your finger off. You know, you wouldn't, or you put your hand in a buzzsaw, you wouldn't know it was, you'd be looking off and you'd cut it off. If you don't know fear, in this kind of business, if you're playing on the cutting edge of social change in conflict situations where the, you know, where the sides are lined up and there's violence all the time, you know, you better learn to know it.
What about the time the 4 guys showed up in the street below the hotel?
Yeah, well, that's another time I was afraid. They had hired these people to kill me.
Who had?
The company. And the company was tied in with the power structure in the town. Bill, just to show you how solid they were, one Sunday, every minister in that town prayed I'd leave town. Every church. Every church.
Didn't you get the message? Or didn't he get the message?
Well, he was busy or something because he never did anything about it. I didn't leave, the reason then they sent a delegation to see me and told me I had to leave town. And that was before they got the people to kill me. That was an afterthought. And I said, well, you know, gentlemen, I said, I can appreciate your problem. I said, you know, this town's been nice and quiet, and you've been living off of these people out in the mill villages, and now it's changed. They're beginning to stand up, and I can see why you would want me to leave town. But I said, and I said, you know, there's a lot of logic on your side. You know, the majority of the people here would like for me to leave town. So you could put it to a vote, you know, Democratic decision, I'd have to leave town. But I said, none of those things are factors in this. And they were getting ready for some real pious, you know, statements, you know. So I said, well, you have to understand my problem. I said, I come from the mountains, you know. And I said, you know what happens in the mountains. You know, people live back in the mountains and they inbreed and a lot of degeneracy takes place. And people get so they don't have any their mental facilities are impaired. Of course, they believe all that stuff, you see, so I knew they'd read all this stuff and they believe. And I said, you know, I'm just so degenerate, I haven't got the energy to leave. They were fit to be tied. They stormed out of that room. But they were really.
And then they put out a contract.
Then they put out a contract, and these people came, and
how many of them?
4. And my hotel was across from the courthouse, and the sheriff's office was right across from on the side next to me, where I could see the sheriff all the time, and he could see my room. The sheriff left town, all the police left town, they closed the post office, they closed the stores, everybody left town in the middle of Wednesday afternoon. Nobody had ever left those posts before in the history of that town. And I kind of walked down the street, and I just didn't pay much attention to it, but I noticed everything was so quiet. And I looked over to the courthouse, and everything was quiet. There's usually a hubbub around there. So I went up to my room, you know, kind of wondering about why all this quietness is around. Nobody's seen anybody around the hotel. Pretty soon this car came up, and they stopped outside my window. And I was sitting looking because, you know, I was a little apprehensive. I didn't know about what. And the Klan had tried to run me out before that, so I was kind of, you know, had that on my mind. So I looked out the window, and these fellows were sitting in that car. And then I knew, you know, they had guns. I knew what was happening. The town had cleared out. They was going to. So I thought, well, this is it, Horton, you know. You got to think fast and keep you calm. So I leaned out the window and I said, "Hey, what are you fellas doing?" And they looked up and, you know, they were going to come up. They didn't expect me to see them, and they didn't say anything. And I said, "Well, I understand you're supposed to kill me, you know." So they looked a little confused that I knew. And I said, "You know, I've been trying to learn how to be an organizer, you know, get some practice organizing. And the more experience I have, the better I'll be, you know." And I said, "This is probably the last chance I'll have to learn anything. Maybe I'll just practice a little on you, you know." And he said, don't you want me to organize you? My last effort to organize. They laughed. They thought that was fine. One guy took a big swig of beer, and they laughed and pointed up to me and waved his gun. I said, "Organize us." I said, "Yeah, you've got to be organized." And we don't have anything to do with organization. That's, you're a troublemaker, you're a communist. I said, no. I said, I'll organize. You need to be organized. And I said, you don't understand. I said, now you coming up here to kill me. And I said, you're gonna kill me. But I said, each of you thinks, that you won't be killed. Now some of you are going to be killed, because I'm gonna. And I went over, and a holiness preacher had brought me a big old gun, and I just put it in the drawer. I never even picked it up. And he said, you got to keep this in here. He gave me a blessing and told me to keep that gun.
A holiness preacher?
Yeah, he's a worker in the plant. Good union man. And so I remember that gun, so I went over and got that gun, and I sat there with that gun in my hand. And I said, now, when you come up here, the first person comes through the door, I'm going to kill him. And maybe the second person, I'm going to kill him. Now, the third person and the fourth person is going to kill me. I said, that's the way it's going to be, you see. I said, now, you never thought about the two of you who are going to be dead in a few minutes. You just thought about me being dead. Is that right, And they started looking at each other because they hadn't thought about it that way. And I said to the guy in the front, you're going to be dead in a few minutes? You got a family? What are they going to think when you come back home in a box? I said, or what about you in the back seat there? I said, you look tough. I said, maybe they'll put you in front, and you'll be dead. You ready for this? You guys ready to die? Now, let's see, which two are you going to be dead? Now, you got to get organized so you can decide among yourselves who's going to be dead. So I said, that's why you need to organize. And I never will forget the feeling. I felt like I was really getting through to him, So I sat there with that gun, and I had the greatest desire to try to twirl it, like you do in the movies. And I knew damn well if I did it, I'd throw it out the window. But I wanted so much to sit there, and while they're making up their mind, twist that pistol around my finger. But I figured I'd lose it, so I better not try that. I thought I was going too far. So I sat there holding on to it, scared to death.
Could you have shot the damn thing?
I never even thought about it. I figured I'd talk my way out of it, not shoot my way out of it. I never even looked at the gun to see that way, because I was gambling on talking them out of it. And sure enough, they started looking, and they took some more beer, and they talked, and they looked at it. And I just kept holding that gun at them. I said, okay, you guys got together. Who's going to be dead? Hey, you in the front seat. I just kept individualizing them, you see. I said, maybe I shoot you in the head, or maybe heart. I guess I could shoot you in the heart, or blow your guts out. I said, now, you'd spread out. You're a fat man, your guts spread out up here in the hallway. And that'd be nice, I just kept just being nasty to them. They drove away. And I just sunk back in.
The Adventures of Myles Horton will continue next week. I'm Bill Moyers.
For a single transcript of this two-part program, please send $3 to Bill Moyers Journal, Box 900, New York, New York, 10101. Funding for this program has been provided by this station and other public television stations, and by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Funding for this program is provided by this station and other public television stations, and by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Appalachia has been been the guinea pig of the country. All, you know, if anybody wants to try out an idea, they try it out in this region. And we've been missionary to death, starting back with the religious missionaries. You know, we're going to bring down the New England culture for us mountain folks and teach us how to keep some manners, along with a lot of good solid education. And they should be credited with that. Then with the political, you know, missionaries come in to exploit. Then economic people come in to save the South by buying up the land and developing industry. Now the war on poverty missionaries that came in, and now we're getting the multinational people coming in. So we've always been, somebody's always been coming in and going to save the region, and they always take more out than they bring in.
Tonight we continue with the adventures of the radical hillbilly Myles Horton. I'm Bill Moyers. Few people I know have seen as much change in the American South or helped to bring it about as Myles Horton. He's been beaten up, locked up, put upon, and railed against by racists, toughs, demagogues, and governors. But for almost 50 years now, he has gone on with this special kind of teaching, helping people to discover within themselves the courage and ability to confront reality and change it. Myles Horton came to his mission from a childhood among the mountain people of Appalachia, a land rich in beauty but a colony of poverty. Nothing will change, said Horton to himself, until we change, until we throw off our dependence and act for ourselves. So in 1932, in the mountains west of Chattanooga, in one of America's poorest counties, Myles Horton founded the Highlander Folk School, dedicated to the belief that poor working-class people, adults, could learn to take charge of their lives and circumstance. At first, he ran workshops to train organizers for the CIO, Jim Crow laws for bad integration, but Horton invited blacks and whites alike, and Highlander became one of the few places in the South where the two races could meet under the same roof. In the early 1950s, Horton turned the emphasis of his workshops from union organizing to civil rights. Highlander was now a principal gathering place of the moving forces of the Black Revolution. Martin Luther King came. So did Rosa Parks, Andrew Young, Julian Bond, Stokely Carmichael, and scores of unsung foot soldiers in the long march of Southern blacks toward equality. The state tried to close it down. The Klan harassed it. State troopers raided it. But Highlander seemed indestructible, and so did Myles Horton. He's 75 now, and his school, from which he has stepped aside as leader in favor of younger colleagues, is preparing to celebrate its 50th anniversary next year. Recently, I called upon Myles Horton at Highlander, now located on a farm near Knoxville. I began the second part of our conversation by asking him about the importance of music in his work over the years.
One of the ideas that we had at the beginning of Highlander was you had to use cultural activities as part of the program, because people need not just intellectual discussion or even
politics,
active learning from action and doing things, but they also need something to, you know, to cultivate the spirit and soul. And it's obvious that the drama and dance and music and things like that would contribute, in art of different kinds. We were rather fortunate in that when Zilphia, my wife, came to Highlander, she was a trained musician from Arkansas, and she not only had a background of miner's background. Her father was a coal miner, but she also had, you know, musical training. But the musical training, you know, was a classical kind you get in a, you know, going through college and so on. So she soon, you know, started singing labor songs and folk songs and learned to play the guitar and accordion, and she played the piano, and to use her music to help fit into the program. At the same time she was doing that, she was a good teacher. She was a very good teacher, like training shop stewards in how to take up grievances and in the Highlander way of doing it, not just technically, but in rallying the people behind you. She'd used drama as part of her way of teaching, so she developed a drama program along with the music program. So she had two kinds of programs going.
Do you remember that song that John Hancock of the Tenant Farmers taught Zilphia called No More Mourning?
Yeah, that's a beautiful song. I was teaching in a school for sharecroppers, tenant farmers out in Little Rock, Arkansas, in a school that Claude Williams ran. And the police were, harassing us because we had some whites and blacks together there. And every time the police had come, why, I would sit down in the audience like a white person being entertained, and the blacks would start leading singing. And John Hancock became the star because he'd make up songs. We'd run out of songs. And that's where I brought that back to Zilphia. I collected that.
Do you remember that song?
Yeah, I can't remember the words now, but I remember.
No more mourning, no more mourning, no more mourning. After a while and
before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home.
No more mourning, no more mourning, no more mourning over me, and before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
Leadbelly was here too, wasn't he? He wrote a song that was going to be used to raise money for Highlander that became a classic.
Yeah.
Remember that one?
Yeah, Leadbelly was never at Highlander. He always wanted to come to Highlander, but he did 3 or 4 benefit concerts for Highlander.
But he did write that song.
Oh yeah, he did a lot of music. Zilphia used to play with him. They'd play together. He said she's the only white woman could play, black music he ever saw, and he'd get her to play with him. Every time she was around, she'd get on the piano and play with him.
Bourgeois blues.
And he sung and we were at a party, a fundraising party in New York, and that's back when we had respectable sort of sponsorship like Mrs. Roosevelt and all the big people.
Eleanor Roosevelt?
Eleanor Roosevelt. She's at Highlander twice. She's a great supporter of Highlander, but at that time she helped us use her influence to get a bunch of name people together there. And Leadbelly was a performer at that place, and when we were getting ready to put on the program, Leadbelly were backstage playing, just having fun, and he said he wanted to try this song out on her. He just was working on, because he'd tried to get it done for that occasion. He wanted to use it for that occasion, but he hadn't finished it. And so she liked it so well, she said, go ahead and use it anyway. She persuaded him to sing it, even though he wasn't quite satisfied with it. And so that was the beginning of Bourgeois Blues. That was the first time it was ever sung.
Sweet white Martha was standing up there. Heard a white man say, I don't want no Negroes up there. He was a bourgeois man. Woo, living in a bourgeois town. I got a bourgeois blues, I'm gonna spread it all around. This is the home of the brave, the land of the free. I don't want to be mistreated by no bourgeoisie, Lord, in a bourgeois town. Ooh, it's a bourgeois town. I got a bourgeois blues, I'm gonna spread the news all around.
There's a story that a couple of striking tobacco workers from Charleston, South Carolina, brought your wife, Zilphia, a song which she and Pete Seeger then turned into what has become one of the most famous hymns of the civil rights movement, We Shall Overcome. Is that a true story?
Well, it's almost. There was a strike of tobacco workers working in a tobacco plant in Charleston, South Carolina. And we always encourage students to bring songs that they had written or use on a picket line, just like Guy does today. We still do the same thing here now. And that song was a kind of a rough-hewn song that they'd gotten from a black hymnal. The blacks had sung it, and the white people picked up. They tried to make a strike song out of it, and it's a song that Zilphia said wasn't singable. It's too hard to sing. So she sat down at the piano like she always did with people like that, and they worked out the music so it would be simpler. She used to say there's singable songs, and then there was songs like A Star Spangled Banner, which nobody should sing. She thought songs should be easier to sing. So that was revised, and that became a very popular song that week. People liked it after they simplified it a little bit.
We will overcome. We will overcome.
will overcome someday.
For 10 years, it was just a Highlander song. And then the labor movement started using it a little bit more, and then it died down, and it just kind of stayed in the Highlander domain. And then Guy Carawan, who's in charge of music here now, taught that song, which is a black people song, to a lot of the people in SNCC, and later on did it for a Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the song came back to the people where it originated from, and then it became a popular song again in the civil rights movement. Now, as you know, it's sung around the world. It's everywhere.
How do you assess its impact on our time?
Oh, Lord, there's no one song that I know of, but it's still, you see the Irish scrapping. You see people in Chile. They use it in Chile. It was used in Cuba. It's sung in China. All the schools sing it in China. It's used everywhere. I don't know of any song of that kind that is so widespread.
Sort of symbolized, didn't it, your own transformation from the Union movement to civil rights?
Yeah. Some people trying to describe Highlander, they said Highlander is just a series of different schools. We were a community school, we were a poverty, depression school, we were industrial union school, Seattle school, we were a farmer labor school, we were civil rights school, we were Appalachian school. That's one way to describe it, because you have to, break things up to describe them. But to me, it's very inaccurate. Holland's just been one school all the way through. We're just doing the same thing with different groups of people. We try to empower people. We're using these different periods of interest in the South as a means of educating people to take more control of their own lives. And although the subject matter differs, the approach differs, the purpose is the same. We use the same methods that I described earlier, and the same purpose. The purpose is to help people become so empowered that they can begin to have something to do with their lives. And you can't do it with large numbers of people.
Yeah.
You see.
Is that why you've stayed small? I mean, what's
Well, see, reason I knew that intellectually, and I said, well, Highlander, I never want to be big, because you always want to deal with 20 or 30 people at a time, because that seems to be the maximum you can deal with effectively. And don't want to have a lot of branches, you just want to be small. And whatever influence you have, developing people with a multiplication influence, where they multiply, that's where you get your 2 cents worth. You multiply people. You deal with leaders who multiply themselves. Then you can have an outreach. You don't do mass education, so you don't need to deal with a lot of people at a time, because that's not the way you get your brownie points built up. It's how many people are influenced, so that's done best by taking people who can multiply themselves.
I'll tell you something that in looking back over your life has helped me. And it's what you discovered about how much conflict is in the lives of poor people. And how often only conflict is the way they can resolve their problems. The well-educated middle...
That's a very hard thing to explain to my nonviolent pacifist friends. They say, of course you'd always advise against violence. And I say, no, I said, Highlander, the people that Highlander deal with live a life of violence. And this violence takes a lot of forms, not just the physical violence, but it's violence of starvation, violence of depriving people of education, violence of oppression of various kinds. All those are forms of violence. So you have to choose a lesser violence always, never between. Our choice at Highlander is seldom between violence and nonviolence. It's between the lesser forms of violence. We had a discussion with some of the young people that came down from the east during the big summer in Mississippi, in 64. And we were down at Greenwood, Mississippi, and they were talking about, maybe we better talk to the police. Maybe, after all, they're not all bad, and some of us could talk to the police. And I remember these kids, just a bunch of them from Yale, just had come down, and they were going to talk to the police. So one of these black guys said, no. And finally this white guy said to this fellow, why is it that you don't want to talk to the police? He says, when they seize this black head, they hits it. Now, see, that's what blacks have known all the time, and people don't know. They just hit them because they're black.
Well,
they
just
kill them because they're black.
What the point I want to get at, because I think it's essential to you, is that when middle class, upper class, well-intentioned, liberal people rule out conflict as a way of poor people solving their problems, they leave those poor people powerless, don't they?
No, they support the status quo. What they're doing is reinforcing the situation, firming up a situation as it is, and not allowing for any change, and the condition of those people get worse, continually worse, because if you don't struggle against oppression, oppression moves in on you. So what they're doing, they're accelerating the rate of repression on people by not understanding it has to be a struggle. A struggle is not only, my point of view, the moral thing to do, but it's a great learning experience. The greatest education comes from action, and the greatest action is struggle for justice. So either deny people the opportunity to become empowered and educated, they deny people the right to be free and you know, to be people. And they do it all in the name of law and order.
Have you ever taught violence?
I haven't used violence since I was 14 years old. I don't neither practice or advocate violence. But I know that in a class-structured society, violence exists, and the victims are the poor. And I'm not going to stand back and when they try to devise ways of doing things and not try to help them work out their own ways of doing it. And I'm also sure in my own mind that there times comes when you've exhausted every avenue of change, and in a revolutionary situation, if the people won't get off your back and won't give you leeway to grow, you got to push them off. And that's violence.
Well, I think it's important to point out, as I understand your teachings, that conflict is a form of violence without necessarily being ultimately violent against person, that you believed that organizers, workers, should bring conflict into the lives of the workplace in order to force the companies to change their ways, that you thought that blacks should confront white society and the power structure and bring conflict. And my point earlier was that most people want to look the other way.
Yeah. See, that conflict is already there. You don't bring that conflict. The conflict is there, but it's hushed up from both sides. Blacks are afraid to do anything about it. Union people are afraid to get killed. Whites don't want to do it because they want to change the structure, because they want to do it by having meetings another 100 years, you know, praying another 100 years. So nobody wants to do it. So you take a situation like that, and you with the people you're working with, you say, look, this conflict is there. You've lived with it long time. The violence is operating in various ways. So, you know, let's look at it. And maybe by expanding that area of violence or interpreting that area of violence, we can confront the situation in such a way that we can begin to resolve it. Now, we don't try to resolve situations at the lower level of accommodation, you know, to law and order. We try to resolve situations at a higher level of justice. So when we talk about using conflict, we don't use it to settle something. We use it to cause a real, you know, banging of the forces, so you come out, resolve it at a higher level, like in the civil rights movement. We weren't interested in settling for having some kind of peaceful relations with blacks and whites until blacks got, you know, their rights. And I knew as a white Southerner that the quickest way to educate white Southerners was not to talk to them, not to deal with, but for the blacks to stand up and demand to be treated as equals. Then you would educate white Southerners to respect them as equals, the fastest way. So that was our philosophy.
Rosa Parks was at a workship at Highlander a couple of months before she went back to Montgomery sat down on that bus and refused to get up and give her seat to a white man. Now, she introduced conflict in a situation that heretofore had conflict repressed for her, but not present for the white.
The conflict was there all along.
Yeah.
She just refused to accept the situation, and that brought the conflict which was there to the surface. And then when they brought the police officer, she still, you know, accelerated the conflict by making them take her to jail. So she set the thing up, set the conflict where it could be seen, and it made it possible for Edie Nixon, the black organizer down there for the Pullman Porters Union, to organize the boycott and to get King involved. He's the one that got King into that situation. King didn't want to get in it. he first went to Abernathy. He had the biggest church. Abernathy didn't want to do it. So he went to King because he had the smallest church. If he either had the big church or he's going to take one that didn't have any competition. So Martin was picked simply because he is a new minister there and low on a totem pole. And Martin said, well, we'll think it, we'll let you know tomorrow. And Coretta and I, we decided we weren't going to get involved in anything, and he's really building up to go and take over his father's church. These black people own these churches, like a farm.
That was his destiny.
And it was all planned for him. And he knew that. I met Martin when he was a junior in college, and when I met him, his father told me Martin's going to take his church one day.
So he didn't want to get off into this.
He didn't want to get off into this.
Maelstrom.
And he said, well, I'll let you know tomorrow. Nixon went back, sent out the announcements that it's going to be in Martin's church. So he called Martin next day and said, Dr. King, what have you decided to do? And Martin says, well, we've thought about it, we're going to do it. He says, it's a good thing because the announcements have been out for about 4 hours.
Was it a coincidence that the trigger of all this, Rosa Parks on the bus, happened 2 months after she was at Highlander? Was that just a coincidence?
No, not according to Rosa. Now, I never try to tell what happens at Highlander. I just let the people it happens to tell, Rosa said that the connection between those two things was that at Highlander, it was the first time in her life she had met white people she could trust, fully trust. And what Rosa had known some wonderful white people who were full social equality, but what she was saying was she'd never been in a place where you could demonstrate by everything that happened that you believed in full social equality. The Highlander was, anywhere you went, it was, everybody was equal. There's no, was no way. I always said we were too small and too poor to discriminate. We didn't have any facilities for discriminate. There's no way we could have done it if we wanted to, So, Rose just saw a total way of living she'd never seen before. And she just couldn't believe that would, happen. She didn't go back with any plans or anything. She went back with a different spirit.
How did that come about that you were able to integrate Highlander? Because the laws of Tennessee were against it.
Yeah.
The churches were against it. The local political leaders were against it. Mm-hmm. Everyone was against it. What was the technique for integrating
well,
this?
We did a little expansion of your home is your castle idea. This one place we were going to do what we pleased in terms of the way we're going to work. And there's certain principles that you just don't question. I grew up in the South knowing all these interracial people who would talk about social equality, but they never eat together. They keep talking themselves into more distance.
Yeah.
They get further apart, the more they talk, and the fewer people do it. They had a few blacks that would meet with the whites and talk, and a few whites would meet with the blacks and talk. The rest of the people got burned out already, and they weren't getting anywhere. But that was the interracial thing in the South. And I learned, when I was in college, to dislike that heartily. And I said, you do it, you act, and then the planning and thinking comes first. If I ever get a chance, I'm going to act and let the talk come later. I'm not going to talk first, because you talk yourself out of it. You don't talk yourself into it. But if you can set up a situation where people act, then the action will change their heart. So that's the reverse what most people
But that was tough to do, because many of those union organizers you had here were often members of the Klan.
Well, the head of the educational director, which was the head of the Ruther campaign, when Ruther ran for against R.J. Thomas for the presidency, was a former Klan official, according to him. He told me himself that he was selected for that job because he's a Klan official, and Ruther figured there's more Klan people in the Union in the South than were non-Klan people. We work with George. We work with him. We work with people. Knowing all the time they were that kind of people. And they objected to blacks at Highlander. In fact, they tried to have a workshop at Highlander without any blacks, and I wouldn't let them. I told them they had to leave. And they said, well, we paid you, we reserved this place, but we got all this expense. I said, I don't care what you've done. This black guy came up, he heard about it, and he came up, and I said, he's going to stay or nobody stays. And a lot of these people, you didn't know me from outside the South, they said, well, nobody can tell us what to do, we're the powerful sort of thing. But people in the South I'd worked with, they told them, I meant what I said, and that they'd leave when I told them they'd leave. And they said, who is this guy that can tell us we have to leave? And this guy who used to be the Klansman who was instrumental in helping set that up, but knew me, he says, Myles has ways for you to move And he said, if you don't want some of these mountaineers coming in and shooting your ass out, you better get going when he tells you. Said, he knows what he's talking about. Said, he's got the power. So instead of leaving, they let that black guy stay. See, that's the way you get them used to it. And then then those same people started bringing blacks to Highlander. Once you make them do it some way, then they'll find out it's not so bad, and they'll keep on doing it. It was the UAW after that set the pattern of unions always bringing blacks to Highlander. But I had to be a little rough on them to start with, you know.
What's that story about the time the white farmers were here?
Oh, that's the farmers union. We organized the National Farmers Union, a very good organization, a liberal organization of farmers. You organized families into cooperatives and so on. And we were having a workshop with people from Alabama and up here in East Tennessee and all around, down in West Tennessee, which is a real racist part of the country. And we had some black people in that workshop, farmers. So we were milling around outside, and these white farmers says, these black people here, says, what are they doing here? And I said, I don't know. I said, we have a lot of different sessions here, different kinds of people come, union people come, church people come, all kinds of people come. But this is for farmers union people, and we don't have anybody here but farmers union. But I said, some people get mixed up, and I said, probably they just thought this was a workshop on NAACP or something else. Maybe, but I don't know. I said, I'd like to know myself. And I said, you go out there, you two guys go and ask them. You go find out if they're farmers. Go ask them they're farmers.
The two white guys go out and ask.
Yeah, ask those black guys if they remember the farmers union. We don't want them to tell me, you come back and tell me and we'll run them off, if they're not farmers and aren't farmers union members. They can't think of anything else to say, so they go and ask them. If I say, yeah, we're from a farmers union, so and so and so and so and so and so, and I can see this fellow scratching their head, and the mountain guy looking at the farmers and looking back at me. We came from up here, just in Greene County, a couple of counties from here. Came back, and I said, what'd they say? They belong here? They're farmers? No, they're farmers. Yeah, they're farmers. And I said, my God, I'm relieved. I said, I thought, we were going to have to send them away. And I just turned and walked off. Then they had the discussion among themselves. They had to deal with all that problem. I wouldn't argue with them, wouldn't do anything. I just left it with them. And then they had to internalize that, you see, and deal with it. Then they said, well, farmers, you remember, we don't want to run them off. Then we have to be nice to them and so on. So they came in and ate with them, and then it was all over,
What does that say about it? What does that say to you?
You have to do things like that all the time.
What does that say to you about identity and about how we shape our perceptions of other people? They didn't want them to come as blacks, but they were welcome as farmers.
Well, they couldn't deal with it. They couldn't deal with the problem I posed for them of people not being welcome if they were farmers, not having a right if they were farmers. It put them in a different category. They weren't blacks, they were farmers. You do that all the time. You help people perceive things differently. You enable them to break out of their incrustation of thinking and perceive things a different way.
Did you find that your efforts in organizing workers and in trying to solve some of the other problems were running into racism everywhere?
Yeah, racism was a barrier. You could go so far. You get people organized, but you could get integrated unions. But then when you tried to relate to the larger community or go beyond just the more practical unionism, you get to politics, for example, then we found that racism always was a barrier. Then we said we're going to have to remove that barrier. It was a negative kind of way of approaching it, but the barrier was in the way of democracy, so you had to get rid of it. So we were trying to devise programs, work out ways for people to learn to work together at that time. Before the 54 decision, we had anticipated that decision by setting up a workshop 4 months in advance to discuss the Supreme Court decision on schools, and there hadn't been a decision. It was a gamble, and they passed the law a month before the workshop, and the recruiting had already been done. Everything had been done in advance. We took chances. We kind of pushed pushed as far as we could. We gambled to try to promote interest in that kind of thing. But we were sure that there's a groundswell. We had been working in South Carolina in what we call the citizenship schools, the schools for teaching blacks to learn enough reading that they could pass the qualify to vote. In South Carolina, you had to read part of the Constitution. And we developed a very successful program there that has eventually spread all over the South, and that was underway at that time. And we had we had students, college students, black and white, coming to Highlander for 3 or 4 day Easter weekends. And out of that group, about 80% of the people who were in the formation of SNCC came.
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
John Lewis and Julian Bond and the Bevels, all those people had been at Highlander before. John Lewis says he'd been to all kinds of church gatherings and things like that, and at Highlander, the first time they ever ate with white people. So they had that background. So we'd been laying some groundwork in the hopes that something would happen.
But when they were here, when they were gathering to hold workshops on direct action, voter education, didn't you start coming under sustained attack from Alabama, Tennessee?
That's when people in Tennessee, even though they opposed Highlander, didn't initiate those things. The first step taken against Highlander was a state investigation of Highlander initiated by the Attorney General in Arkansas, who came over and asked that they investigate Highlander, because Highlander was training a lot of people. A lot of people from Arkansas were coming to Highlander. They were coming back into Arkansas and raising Cain. That was the first outside pressure. Then later on, the governor of Georgia sent an agent to a workshop where Martin Luther King spoke. They used that meeting. They took pictures of that meeting. And they had those big billboards all over the South. Martin Luther King at the Communist Training School.
Who took pictures?
The agent from the governor of Georgia. And they claimed that they circulated over 2 million copies of that propaganda against Highlander.
Showing Martin Luther King at a communist meeting.
Communist Training School, they said. And it was Martin speaking at that meeting. And that was before Martin was known very well. He was it was the Montgomery Improvement Association then, but we thought something was going to come of that. But most people didn't think much was going to come of it.
Wasn't there a trial?
Well, as a result of this expose, so-called expose, they told the people of Tennessee, the government, you got to find a way to put those people out of business. It's not just Tennessee matter, and that led to the trial. That was the impetus that led to the trial. So they finally had a raid on the school.
Literally? I mean, the police came in?
Well, it was vigilantes, and police and vigilantes. We didn't know who was who. There's about 20 people came in, armed people. We were having there's a group of a choir from one of the Montgomery churches there on a kind of a weekend sort of program, and they were high school age kids. And they were looking at a movie that George Mitchell made called "A Face of the South," and they raided them while the lights were off, looking at this movie. And they came in and with their guns flashing around, and they demanded to turn on the lights, and nobody would turn on the lights. And it was while the darkness, but it was still dark, that those kids started singing, "We shall overcome." And that night they added, "We are not afraid," which became one of the permanent verses. That was the night that was invented by those high school age kids from Montgomery. They said this right back at the vigilantes, "We're not afraid, we're not afraid." That became one of the lines of the song. But they hauled Seth McCart, Guy Carawan, and some other people off to jail. I wasn't there at the time. I was away. They hauled them into jail and kept them overnight, and just to set up a trial.
What did they charge them with?
They charged them with having liquor and serving liquor. And Steph McClark was running. She's a anti-liquor religious leader, and Guy doesn't drink, and they were serving Kool-Aid to those kids. That was the drinkers.
Wasn't there some beer too?
No, but no. What we had done in previous years, when labor people were there, since we lived 2 miles out in the country, and black and white people couldn't go uptown and drink beer because it's illegal, to be served beer in town. We would get a case of beer and put it in a cooler and put a cigar box there, and everybody put in a quarter at that time. And when you ran out, somebody would take the box and go get another case of beer and put it in the cooler. So later on, the judge ruled that was selling beer without a license. And his example is if 3 people in a room and one of them goes out and buys 3 cans of beer and 2 people give him a quarter apiece, legally that's selling beer. So that's the illustration he himself used, the judge used. So he said that according to my testimony, which nobody could ever question, he said I was the most reliable witness in the trial, that we did that. I explained the process. I explained just what we did. And he said it was on the basis of my explanation that he found us guilty of selling beer, but there wasn't any beer at that time. But
anything to try to bring a charge against you, a case against you, close you down.
No, they had 18 charges against us. One charge, we were running an integrated school, to which we pled guilty proudly and said we always had, we always going to keep on doing it. So we were guilty of that. But they also they charged us with selling liquor without a license. And they charged me with operating a school for personal gain. Not personally. I was never in the court, you know, as Myles Horton, but I was as Highlander. I was operating a school for personal gain. They testified that I had never taken personal gain, but there's no limit to what people could take. We had a system then, pretty much as it is now. People get paid on the basis of the size of their families, and it's still true today. And if there's a problem, somebody gets sick or a child gets sick or something, and it needs more money, well, you know, that's all the money that people have, so the school will provide it. So they said, is there a top on how much you can provide? And I said, no, we never discussed that. The top on it because we didn't have it. And a top on it because people would only take what they needed. And because nobody wanted to spend time raising money, everybody wanted to run programs. So I said, it's not a problem. And he said, is there no legal requirement that says you can't limits? And I said, no, there's no legal requirement about any of it. It's all just understood. So he says, on the basis of that, then you could, you know, take some money. And he says, Horton is growing a melon. He hadn't cut it yet, but he's getting ready to cut it. And I was convicted on anticipation on his part of me cutting the melon later on. That was the decision.
What does it make you feel like when the whole apparatus of the state, as well as the whole weight of public opinion, are turned against you, and you're hounded and intimidated and harassed?
No, it's not quite that clear cut. There was never a time when we didn't have friends. At that time, we had the labor movement, still a tremendous lot of support from the labor movement, who opposed all of this. We had the Nashville Tennessean, editorially supporting Highlander. We had the Chattanooga Times, the mother of the New York Times, supporting Highlander. So we weren't completely alone.
So
we gradually won over other papers in Memphis, other places, because it's such a raw deal. What I used to do, I would take advantage of those hearings to try to educate the people of Tennessee, because it's all covered by radio, TV, and news. It was the big thing in Tennessee, so I'd use that as public education. And we of course, the enemies stayed enemies. You don't win them over, but you make friends. And during a trial, you know, to give you an idea of the kind of support we had, the Chattanooga Times covering that trial said that every witness the state had, without a single exception, had been convicted and had served time. Every witness. And he says, Highlander didn't have any witnesses like that. And said, in fact, Horton refused to subpoena any witnesses. He said, if there's not enough volunteers to testify for Highlander after all these years, we don't need support. Over 200 people signed up to testify. So the papers tell those stories. So, you know, gradually people were get educated. We were never all alone.
What are you doing right now?
Right now, we're in a kind of a transition period in a way. We've been working for the last 10 years or more on Appalachia, trying to help get a lot of spirit in Appalachia. When we first started out, we decided that the civil rights movement, you know, had plenty of leadership. Hundreds and hundreds of people had been to Highlander, and thousands had been to citizenship schools that came out of Highlander. And there's plenty of leadership developed out of the civil rights movement. So we said, look, you don't need Highlander, you can run your own programs. We set up a program for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I was advisor to SNCC on the educational program. So we said, you know, you've got all you need out of Highlander. They didn't agree with that, but we said, you know, you can do your own programs. We'll give you our blessing, but you're not going to do it. We're going to come back to where we started in the mountains and start working with our own people, because they were behind. And we're going to try to get some consciousness of what can happen in Appalachia, build up. We started out in the about 60, in the mid-60s, and we had a very hard time getting a few people together to play music. Now you can't keep them away, you know, when we have to.
Mountain people?
Yeah. And we get people together to talk about activities of different kinds. Half a dozen people's organizations in Appalachia, none of them working together. The spirit was low. But since then, we've come a long way in Appalachia. There's maybe 50 organizations which now are combined in Appalachian Alliance, which is something that we've always felt it was important to get people together instead of competing. They work together. Just completed a land study.
What did it show?
Which as part of the Appalachian Alliance, that showed that I don't know, maybe practically three-fourths of the land in Appalachia is absentee-owned. Those people pay 1/3 the taxes on their land that the local people pay, which means there's no tax base for schools, health, roads, or anything.
Well, give me an inventory of the problems that are faced by Appalachia.
You know,
I thought there had been a war on poverty and an Appalachian Regional Commission. I thought all of that had been...
Well, when the war on poverty was announced, and I don't have to explain that to you, I was asked if I thought that was a good thing. And I said, yes, but I'd like to qualify it. And they said, but do you think that's going to be a good program, going to get people out of poverty? I said, no, I don't think it'll deal with poverty, although that's a subject. But I think a lot of people will get experiences out of that will enable them to do things on their own later on, and they'll find out that something can't come down from on high that'll solve their problems for them. So there'll be a lot of good learning to take place. And I was asked, well, what's Highlander's role? I said, wait a little bit till people start getting disillusioned, and then start trying to help people analyze their experiences so they can build on it, to take things in their own hands and start doing things for themselves, and bringing pressure on the government to do sounder jobs. So that was my analysis when it was first announced. And that's what the program of Highlander was, to try to, you know, salvage from the people that learned something, you know, out of that, some capabilities of doing things.
Is there a lot of disillusionment in Appalachia?
Oh, yes. Appalachia has been the guinea pig of the country. You know, if anybody wants to try out an idea, they try it out in this region. And we've been missionary to death, starting back with the religious missionaries. You know, we're going to bring down the New England culture for us mountain folks and teach us how to keep some manners, along with a lot of good solid education. And they should be credited with that. Then the political, you know, missionaries come in to exploit. Then economic people come in to save the South by buying up the land and developing industry. Now the war on poverty missionaries that came in, and now we're getting the multinational people coming in. So we've always been, somebody's always been coming in and going to save the region, and they always take more out than they bring in. And that's why we think people have to, you know, take control of their own organizations and own lives.
Well, how are you going to do that? I mean,
we're making a little headway in the sense that the Appalachian Alliance has a voice. The Appalachians never had a voice before. There's a structure for a voice.
Who are these people in it?
There are about 50 people's organizations in the region. Practically all the organizations in the region are run by people in that, and they've learned to work together. We've got a lot of Appalachian study programs going. In fact, all the universities. There was a time when there weren't any, not 10 years ago.
What about the economic reality?
Well, see, the thing that we've been trying to get people to understand is that this wave of people living on the land, getting back and retreating into the past is not going to help Appalachia. That's Appalachia is tied into through the multinationals with the rest of the world. We're part of the world. So one thing Highlander's into is bringing people from. Appalachia is kind of a third world country. Get the third world people together, you know.
To do what? Because if three-fourths of the land is owned by absentee owners, how in the devil are you going to bring pressure against them? What do you want them to do?
Well, you know, they don't have to stay that way. You know, if you get enough people power built up, you can do things with those big chunks of land.
Now you're sounding like the utopian again.
No, I'm just saying you could. I'm talking about some direct action, moving in and occupying some of them. You know, really have a showdown and force the issue so people begin to understand that you can't have Appalachia is rich in resources. It's poor in people because all the richness goes out. And, you know, we got to find a way to take back some of the richness that belongs to the people.
Haven't you been in jail enough?
Oh, about a dozen times, maybe.
Yeah, but isn't that enough? I mean,
I don't want to go to jail. I never did want to go to jail.
But I mean, if you start urging people to occupy absentee-owned land, if you start telling them to take it back, you're going to wind up in jail or
well, you know, we did that in our American Revolution. We started taking over British-owned land right and left. Remember? That's how we got this country going. You know, it's a good American tradition. Of course, you're right about the law and order people. They don't understand that, but they can be educated. I know I'm serious. I think I think somehow the people got to take back the sources of their wealth. And I don't think we're ready for that. I don't think people understand that. But I think they got to quit trying to escape, you know, hide out, and start standing up and saying we demand our rights.
Who are the losers in Appalachian? Who are the winners?
Well, the people who are in Appalachia who are the winners are the agents for the absentee-owned companies, you know, and the people who work for them in terms of economic welfare. The losers, of course, are the people back in the hollers who have no tax base to support their schools and their communities.
So is the issue still, as it was 20 years ago, poverty?
Sure, it's poverty.
But
it's relative poverty. Poverty is a relative thing. You know, people say, you know, capitalism's a wonderful thing. Look how much better it was now than when you were growing up. And I say the gap between the rich and the poor is wider. And the important thing is a lack of distribution of the wealth and use of the wealth. We don't have people starving as they were doing when Highlander started. Not many anyway. But the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer relative to each other, you know. The blacks, as a result of the civil rights movement, the middle class blacks prospered. And it's misleading to talk about blacks prospering because the majority of working class blacks are worse off in relation to working class whites than they were before the civil rights movement. Those problems haven't been dealt with. Problems of poverty haven't been dealt with.
Powerlessness.
And they've got to have power in the hands of those people. Now, one way to get at this, I guess there are two theories of how you have revolution, and that's what I'm talking about. One is that people are desperate, and out of desperation they act. I think that leads to fascism. I don't think that's, you know, I think people who are desperate are going to follow any leader that comes along. In fact, it's kind of the desperate people who voted for Reagan. A lot of desperate people voted for Reagan and think he'll have a gimmick. That hat fooled him. Up in Canada the other day, I read a column that says Reagan was all hat and no cattle. You know, all style and no substance.
And you think people like that?
And I think a lot of poor people, a lot of union people, voted for him thinking he's going to, you know, they were fooled by that hat, you know. They thought, you know, he's got to do something. People still have to think that somebody's going to save them. Somebody's going to come on the white horse to save them. Now, what we've been trying to do is get people to understand that's not the way of salvation. They got to save themselves. And if you got to do it not out of desperation, then you got to do it on the basis of rising expectations of people. We say to people, you deserve more than you have. You know, you deserve part of the good things of this life. You deserve the right to, you know, the opportunity to be more creative. You deserve the opportunity to have a higher standard of living. You deserve the right to, you know, to health as well as theoretical education. You know, we keep saying that you deserve those as human beings, and the system should deliver those to you. If it doesn't change the system till it does. We still are letting people make decisions for us instead of people learning to make decisions. But when people at the bottom learn to make decisions, there's enough of us, you know, that we can begin to bring pressure. Now that situation hadn't developed in Appalachia because the lines aren't as clear-cut. Everybody's got relatives on both sides. And know somebody on both sides, have neighbors on both sides. You know, the black and white case was very clear-cut in the South, you know. There wasn't any problem about understanding, you know, who you were. It was legally enforced racism. You know, it was more clear-cut. And when the blacks started finding out that they could go to jail and still survive, we've been saying, if you do anything we don't like, we'll put you in jail. And so they backed off. They found they could go to jail and survive, even die, you know. And people, when no longer were the whites able to say, we'll put you in jail or we'll kill you and stop the movement, then the blacks took off. But they had a clear-cut issue. And they had some white friends, you know, all along.
Are you saying that democracy is not working very well as you see it?
No, democracy's not working at all in Appalachia, not at all.
How do you define democracy?
Democracy, to me, is where people have a way to control many facets of their lives, political, economic, social, cultural. And so far as they minimize, democracy is denied. And
some would respond that, well, if you've got a good job and you're making a good income, you've got disposable income, then you have some control over your life.
And most of the people in Appalachia, you know, go hunt jobs all over the world. Most of the people all over the United States. We have more people going out of the state to find jobs, out of the region to find jobs in another part of the country because there's not jobs in the region. People that's an outlet, you see, so they can escape that way. In depression, they come back home. But there's too many escape valves that it's hard to get people to get some consensus on what to do. I think I think we got to learn that if you don't have the strength, you don't have the people, you don't have the power to deal with the big United States government, which of course is subject to the multinationals. The United States government doesn't run the show, they're run.
So there's still
so you got to be realistic and know that you got to be big enough to tackle this problem so you got to get allies. That means we got to cut across all kind of racial and religious and national grounds.
So there's still an agenda for an old radical with the time remaining.
I think the interesting thing to me is that we're just beginning a little bit to get people to understand this.
As you talk, there's a paradox. Because you were active in union organizing, and in time, the unions begin to red bait you. The FFL...
they got conservative and bureaucratic.
Well, in time, Northern liberals turned against you because they were afraid of the communist associations. In 1960...
Yeah, well, they were a little afraid that some of the civil rights business would get in their towns and affect their housing.
And then in 1969, after all the battles that you'd helped to win, you went to Chicago, and there you were, the only white face in a sea of black faces, yes. And everybody joined hands to express solidarity, and you held out your hands, and no black would take
I've been saying, we shall overcome, and nobody would touch my hands.
What does all that say to you?
It says that these blacks know that within a racist society, most whites are racist to them, and they could not possibly have known that I'm any different from any other white. I understand that fully well. It bothered me that we hadn't made enough inroads that they would think there might be exceptions to whites, but it didn't bother me personally. I wasn't hurt personally.
It doesn't bother you that in time after time, of people to whom you've given your life and your energies wind up not appreciating?
No, I think you have to be objective, not subjective about these things. You have to understand the forces at work and understand those things happen. I don't take these things personally. I never took these attacks on Highlander. The investigations, the court trials, the confiscation of our property, even the beatings I never took personally, although it was my bones that were cracking. But I mean, I never thought of it as them. That Myles Horton, me, what I know me to be, was what they were after. I was a symbol. I represented something that they hated. I represented something that's challenging their whole way of life. And that's what I represented to the blacks when I was in Chicago. Nobody would take my hand and saying, we shall overcome. I represented, that picture. And when the Klan over here at Maryville beat me up, I represented, bringing blacks into their homes. So I try to keep a little objective about this thing.
How do you see yourself, Myles Horton?
I'm an instrument. That's why I don't take these things personally.
Instrument of what?
I'm an instrument of. I try to be an instrument. And Highlander, I've tried to make Highlander an instrument of empowering people, a way to get people to understand that they can be creative and imaginative. They don't have to put up with this system the way it is. They can create a new one that would be more humane. And they not be so subservient to technology, which is moving in and dominating their lives. I think you got to use yourself and use Highlander to help do that. You don't have a program. I don't have a program. Myles Horton is trying to do this, or Highlander's trying to do this. Here we are. We're trying to use our facilities and what little we know and how we work to help empower people. We were talking earlier about education, how you educate. I was talking about the kind of the structural things that you could put your finger on. But really the way you educate is by example. You educate by your own life, what you are. I'm interested in people learning how to learn. Now, the only way I can help is to share my enthusiasm and my ability to learn myself. If I quit learning, I can't share that. I try to get people to feel, be humane. I think you have to love people to do these things. If I don't love people, I can't help people learn to love people. I can't do anything I don't do myself.
How can you love the man who's beaten you on the head? How can you love the man who won't take your hand when you hold it out in solidarity?
Humanity, you love. I can feel sorry for those people. I'm not a good guy like Martin Luther King was, loving all these people, and thinking you can save them. But I don't think you can save them by loving them. But I think I can survive and understand who they are, and they're unlovable, so I can't love them. But I don't have to hate them. I don't have to think it's personally directed at me. I mean, I just don't bother with them.
You don't have to let them make...
No, see, I think you should have some good, healthy enemies. I'm just about as proud of my enemies as I am of my friends.
Who are your enemies?
Well, the people who are enemies are people who are racist, bigots, who don't believe in people living a decent life. They're people who think poor people ought to stay poor. They're law and order people who think structures come before people. I got a lot of people that believe in things that I don't believe in. I don't want their friendship.
You got some healthy enemies.
Yeah, I think you should measure yourself partly by your enemies as well as your friends.
Do you still believe...
So I'm not a good guy, you know, saying I love all these people personally.
Yeah.
They're not lovable.
Do you believe with your old friend Reinhold Niebuhr that it is possible to establish justice in a sinful world?
I think you can work for justice in a sinful world, and you can always have the hope and sometimes the proof that you can make headway, you know, in terms of justice in a sinful world. The industrial union movement, before it got conservative, was making headway. The civil rights movement was making headway. I've had some experiences of it makes you realize things can happen in dealing with justice and injustice. I don't think there'll ever come a time when there aren't problems. I don't envision a time when everything is perfect. I think I'd like to envision a time when there's more good than evil, which is not true. There's more evil than good today in this society. I'd like to envision a time when people are more people are freer in more areas of their lives. I think all those things are possible. I think you keep pushing, but your sights keep moving too. You know, it's this old story: you climb one mountain, you see another mountain. That doesn't bother me. People have accused me of never being satisfied. Well, why should a human being be satisfied? If you're satisfied, you might as well, that's the end.
From the Highlander Research and Education Center near Knoxville, Tennessee, this has been a conversation with Myles Horton. I'm Bill Moyers.
For a single transcript of this two-part program, please send $3 to Bill Moyers Journal, Box 900, New York, New York, 10101. Funding for this program has been provided by this station and other public television stations, and by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.